Hello APUSHers, this is Mr. Rains, and in today's video, we are going to be diving deep into Period 2. Now Period 2 is going to cover the years 1607 to 1754, with a major focus on the development of England's 13 original colonies in America. So if you don't know much about this time period, or you just want to freshen up, you've come to the right place. So let's dive in. For Period 2, the person I will highlight in the story of significance is Roger Williams. Roger Williams was an English settler to the Americas. He would settle in the Puritan colony of Massachusetts. Well, Roger Williams was asked to be a teacher in the colony, but he would politely decline because he had disagreements with the Puritan teachings. And as you will see in this lesson, the Puritans allowed for very little dissent. A concern of Roger Williams was the fact that the leaders of his colony forced people to go to church that even did not believe. He firmly thought that, contrary to Puritan teaching, that church and state should be separated, that people should have freedom of thought. Obviously, this is going to be a contentious issue throughout all of American history. But Roger Williams also had a disagreement when it came to Native Americans. He questioned how Massachusetts could simply claim the land without first buying it from the Indians. The intolerance of the Puritan community, though, quickly became very clear to Roger Williams. The general court in his colony tried Williams and convicted him of sedition and heresy. He was then ordered to be banished from the colony. The story goes that Williams left during a horrible blizzard, and that he traveled 55 miles through the deep snow, and that the local Wampanoag Indians offered him shelter. He eventually would begin a new settlement in the colony of Rhode Island. His colony would be a place where religion and government would be separate. As we know, this is an important concept even in America today. So now let's dive further into today's lecture by first looking at the first permanent English colony in America, Jamestown. You might remember from our study of Period 1, England had a unique way of sponsoring trips of exploration to Americas through joint stock companies. Joint stock companies, like the Virginia Company of London, would gather money from rich investors hoping to make a profit from gold or whatever in America. The money would be used to pay for ships, crews, and supplies. The investors, they didn't go to America, but they certainly did expect those that did to return a profit for them. It was a capitalist investment opportunity, the same concept that we use in our stock market today. So in 1607, the Virginia Company sent a group of men on a voyage to the Americas with a goal of finding gold and establishing a settlement. Now it would take them over 3 months, and men died on the trip, but eventually they would land in the Chesapeake Bay. They called their settlement Jamestown after the king, King James. And unlike Roanoke, as you remember, disappeared, Jamestown will be the first permanent English settlement in America. And Jamestown would be part of the southern region. Keep in mind, you will not need to know all 13 colonies. However, we will discuss the comparison between regions. The immediate area of Jamestown, unfortunately, was uninhabitable, but the settlers were attacked. They were attacked by local Native Americans less than 2 weeks after their first arrival. In addition, the land was swampy and full of mosquitoes, which carried malaria. Not only that, but the brackish water of the James River was not a good source of water for them. Over 135 settlers would die from malaria and drinking the contaminated water. Not a very good start for this colony. One of the main issues is that they were not properly prepared for the settlement. They did not bring livestock with them, which would have been helpful for farming and starting a settlement. But they did bring with them chemical tests for gold, which they had assumed would be plentiful. Unfortunately for them, they would not find gold in Jamestown. For many, though, it seemed that Jamestown would end up in a failure, similarly to the Roanoke Island incident. However, if it weren't for a very resourceful settler in Jamestown, this may have been the case. And that settler's name was John Smith. I'm sure you've heard of him. When many spent their days looking for gold, John Smith, according to his journals, would scout the area looking for food and resources. Eventually, John Smith would even take over the leadership of the colony of Jamestown, and he implemented the policy, "He who shall not work shall not eat." It is said that during one of his scouting missions, John Smith was captured by the Powhatan Indians. John Smith claimed that he was detained by the natives and was being prepared for death in a ceremonial way. However, in a dramatic way, right before he was set to be clubbed to death, the daughter of the chief, the young Pocahontas, threw herself in front of John Smith, saving his life. Now Disney will tell you the story of Pocahontas, that she fell in love with John Smith and they lived happily ever after. Of course, history is not as perfect as that. In recent years, some have debated the reliability of John Smith's account. But we do know that Pocahontas was a real figure. She was a real person that did have interactions with the Jamestown colony. She would marry a colonist, not John Smith, but John Rolfe, and she adopted many English ways, including becoming a Christian and taking on the name Rebecca. You see that picture on your screen? That is what they think Pocahontas actually looked like. Unfortunately for her, her story does not end happily ever after. In an attempt to recruit more settlers to the colony, Pocahontas was brought to Europe on a goodwill tour. Due to her travels and contact, though, with so many new people in Europe, Pocahontas would die while she was there, never again to return to America. Now that wouldn't make a very good Disney story. Now, like we discussed, the Jamestown settlers faced multiple attacks from Native Americans. You can see in their design of the colony that protection from attack seemed to be a very high priority for the Jamestown settlers. Now, unfortunately, the Virginia Company did not make their money from gold in Jamestown. Gold was not to be found. But the colony won't fail. It'll find a means for great profit through a crop, and that crop is tobacco, or brown gold. Tobacco became the cash crop of Virginia for many, many years. The Virginia Company established a way to get more people to come to grow this profitable crop of tobacco through the headright system. The headright system encouraged colonists to transport indentured servants to the colony for tobacco labor. The indentured servants would then work until they paid off their loan for passage money to Virginia. Eventually, though, in the year 1619, the first African slaves would be brought to Virginia to work these tobacco fields. Now, as more settlers moved into Virginia, it would become increasingly more difficult to enforce law and order. So the Virginia Company decided to do something unique, to allow for a legislative assembly elected by the people. This would be the first example of democracy in America. Now, King James, a believer in divine rights of the monarchs, attempted to dissolve this assembly, but the Virginians would have none of it. They continued to meet on a yearly basis to decide local matters. They called their assembly the House of Burgesses, and it would be established in 1619. You might notice this is the same year that the first African slaves were introduced into America. So a very important year for important concepts that would drag on further into American history. Now, this tradition, established by the House of Burgess, was extremely important to colonial development. Each new English colony demanded their own legislature. Now, starting with the House of Burgesses, Americans had 157 years to practice democracy. By the time of the Declaration of Independence, they were quite good at democracy. Now, only land-owning white men could vote for a representative in the House of Burgesses. But it was certainly a step towards self-rule that we'll come to know and enjoy so much even today. So I'll point out again, two notable land-owning white men could vote only. Two important concepts that will come early in the years of Virginia. It would be the first instance of African slavery and the first example of self-government in the form of the House of Burgesses. Very important concepts that will follow us throughout our entire study of American history. Now again, brown gold or tobacco is bringing the profits to the Virginia colony. John Rolfe called it Virginia's gold and silver. And here is the illustration depicting the House of Burgesses, the first example of self-government in America. Williamsburg, Virginia, even today, is a tourist destination where you can see reenactments like this of the House of Burgesses. So let's move on and let's take a look at a region. The first region I want to look at is the southern region, including that of Virginia, where Jamestown was located. But another Chesapeake or southern colony was that of Maryland. The settlers that came to Virginia came for profit. Remember, they came to find gold. However, many of the first settlers that came to Maryland came due to religious persecution in England. As you might remember, England was a Protestant nation, meaning they were Christian, yes, but non-Catholic Christian. For other religious groups, like Catholics, you can imagine that can present a problem. So Maryland was initially established to be a safe place for Catholics. However, many of those that first arrived in Maryland were both Protestant and Catholic. So religious conflict ensued between the two groups. And eventually the Protestants would actually outnumber the Catholics, which was a strange situation because this was a colony intended to be a safe place for the Catholics. So to resolve this issue, the Maryland colony passed the Act of Toleration, which said that Maryland would be a place of religious freedom to all who believed in Jesus Christ. So this would include both Protestants and Catholics, since both of them believe in Jesus Christ. The Act of Toleration is important, as it is one of the first laws in America that would begin to allow some religious freedom. Now, a number of other colonies would be established in the southern region. These colonies would rely heavily on tobacco and later cotton, and thus were strongholds for the practice of slavery. However, the further south you traveled, such places like the Carolinas and Georgia, the crueler the forms of slavery that were practiced. In the deep South, as it was known, it wasn't uncommon for slaves to be flogged and sometimes killed in very gruesome ways. If a slave, for example, was caught trying to learn how to read, they could be severely punished. However, slaves learned means of resistance and how to adapt to even cruel punishments through slavery. Often, you'll see slaves merging their former beliefs that they brought over from Africa with the beliefs of their colony, such as Christianity, to form brand new practices that were unique to African American communities. Now, another colony that I wanted to mention specifically is the colony of Georgia. Georgia would actually be the last, if we're going in order, of the original 13 colonies to be established. Now, one of the worries at the time was an invasion from Spanish America. Spain had established a number of different colonies, but one of those being in Florida. To protect colonies deemed more valuable, like those in the Carolinas, the hope was that Georgia could be a buffer colony between Spanish Florida and the English Carolinas. Since this won't be considered a very important colony, many debtors and criminals that overpopulated the prisons in England were sent to the colony of Georgia to live. Now again, I will mention the fact that knowing individual colonies is not nearly as significant as knowing colonial regions. So let's look at what the southern colonies had in common with each other. We know that the settlers were mostly men, coming looking for profits. Usually not large family groups were coming to the southern regions. There was a dependence on slave labor. That's because the economy was often based on cash crops like tobacco and later cotton. And you won't see many large cities. Instead, in these southern colonies, there were scattered settlements and plantations. Now it's time to look at another region. Further north is the region known as New England. Roman numeral 3 is New England. Now, similar to the Catholics who came to Maryland, the majority of the settlers that would come into New England originally would come for religious purposes and for religious freedom. Why, you might ask? Well, England, as we've discussed so many times, was a Protestant nation at the time. More specifically, the Anglican Church. The head of the Anglican Church is always the king or monarch of England. Well, for some Christians living in England, they saw corruption within the church, and they hoped to see it purified. Therefore, they called themselves Puritans because they wanted to purify or reform the Anglican Church. However, for some, that wasn't as easy as it seemed, as the King of England had very little toleration for those who disagreed with his church. And so dissatisfaction led some to want a complete split with the Anglican Church. This religious minority was known as the Separatists because they wanted to separate from the Church of England. We know them today as the Pilgrims because their separation would actually take them on a religious adventure into the Americas. Of course, we know their ship was the Mayflower, and we know their colony was Plymouth. But this religious group will leave a longer-lasting legacy in America for a number of different reasons. But one of those would be for a document that would be created by the Pilgrims that they left behind, and that is the Mayflower Compact. We talked earlier about Jamestown and their establishment of a legislative house, the House of Burgesses, that allowed for some self-rule. Well, the Pilgrims who sailed to the New World on the Mayflower had originally intended to settle in Virginia through the permission of the Virginia Company. However, when they had landed in Massachusetts instead, they realized they were all alone. To establish their own authority and to avoid possible chaos in the colony, the Pilgrim leaders did something very unusual and drew up and signed an agreement known as the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was the first agreement for self-government to be created and enforced in America, a very important starting document in American history. Now let's examine the document itself. I will encourage you to read this on your own, to go back to the PowerPoint, to look at the Mayflower Compact. In class, we discussed ways in which this document is a declaration of independence, and in ways that it still declares an allegiance to the King and to Great Britain, because it'll do both. Here's another picture of the Mayflower Compact, an important document claiming self-government. Here we'll show you the three regions that we're going to look at. We already discussed the southern region, and we're starting in on the New England region now. Now, following the Pilgrims, many religious dissidents flooded into Massachusetts. Most notably, we know that this would even include the Puritans, who had first hoped to reform the Anglican Church. But when reform proved impossible, they would make their own way to the Americas for the purpose of freedom of religion. However, What I find strange about the Puritans, when they finally would establish themselves in America, they would not allow for religious freedoms of others. They were radical believers, intolerant of any and all dissenting thought. Not only that, but their religion encouraged settlers to be very superstitious. As a Puritan, you often feared the devil was hiding behind every door and every corner. You even worried about the devil's influence on one's own life. To prove you were a true Christian, the Puritans were hard workers. Their deeds were the sign of their inward faith. Now, as we know, this led to quarrels and debates, and even to the famous or infamous Salem witch trial. The hysteria of the Salem witch trials ended with the punishment and death of fellow settlers deemed to be unfaithful and witches. But the Puritans intended for their colony to be a city upon a hill. Well, what did they mean by this? A city upon a hill is a phrase from the parable of salt and light in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5:14, Jesus told his listeners, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden." And this phrase has been used numerous times throughout American history. Even presidents like JFK, Ronald Reagan, and even President Obama have used the phrase "city upon a hill" to describe American exceptionalism. Now, the colonies in the southern region had great success with cash crops like tobacco. But the New England colonies, however, had rocky soil, which would make it not a great place for farming. Instead, the New England colonies would turn to things like lumber and shipbuilding and whaling as a source of profit. Now remember, knowing individual colonies is not going to be as significant as knowing colonial regions. So now let's look at what New England colonies had in common. We know now that they settled for religious purposes. Often, like the Puritans, religion and politics would be mixed together. Unlike southern regions, in New England, large family groups would come together, and there would be a great emphasis on education. The reason for this? Education was emphasized so that the settlers could read and understand the Bible. Now let's look at this poem, The Day of Doom. This really typifies how a Puritan would often think. They cry, they roar for anguish sore, and gnaw their tongues for horror. But get away without delay, Christ pities not your cry. Depart to hell, there many you yell, and roar eternally. The Puritans use this fear of hell as a motivator for good behavior. Now, Puritans, of course, dominated New England thought, but they weren't always the only viewpoint. However, those that disagreed, like we'll see in Roman numeral 4, were often labeled heretics, or those that were against God. Now, we've already mentioned an infamous heretic, Roger Williams. Roger Williams would be banished and would establish the colony of Rhode Island, which would actually allow for some religious freedom. One point of disagreement between Roger Williams was how to deal with Native Americans. Let's look now at a quote from Roger Williams on this very issue. Roger Williams said, "Boast not, proud English, of thy birth and blood. Thy brother Indian is by birth as good. Of one blood God made him and thee, and all as wise, as fair, as strong, as personal." Obviously, this is not how the Puritans viewed Native Americans, so Roger Williams' belief would be unique for the time. But another name that I like to point out when I talk about heretics and those from the Puritan descent is one known as Anne Hutchinson. Now, Puritan society is a male-dominated society. Religion, government is exclusively for male leadership. Anne Hutchinson, a Puritan woman, would challenge this. The Puritans, like I mentioned, emphasized education. But education often has consequences. And Anne Hutchinson became very well read and developed great theological insight. She knew her Bible well, which is what Puritan society wanted. But she began to use her voice and her views to teach others, and sometimes even to disagree with current Puritan thought. Her disagreements would get her in trouble, just like it had with Roger Williams. Anne Hutchinson would be banished to the colony of Rhode Island. And her famous quote after being banished was this: "I have been found guilty, not of wrongdoing, but of wrong thinking." She thought differently from the Puritans, and that is not tolerated, so she was sent out of the colony. Now here is a statue of Anne Hutchinson. An outcast in her day, Anne Hutchinson has since been judged a heroine in the eyes of history. This statue in her honor is erected in the 19th century, now graces the front of Boston, Massachusetts State House. So now we've discussed the Southern and New England colonies. So this brings us to what's left, the Middle colonies. The Middle colonies were by far the most diverse. New York, originally known as New Amsterdam due to being a Dutch settlement, was home, for example, to a variety of ethnicities, including the first Jewish community. The Middle region was also home to a unique religious group known as the Quakers. The Quakers were much more tolerant than the Puritans of New England, which wouldn't be hard to be, but back in Europe, the Quakers themselves even found opposition. They believed that all people were created equal. That included men and women, peasant and king. Everyone is equal in God's sight. But in addition to this, the Quakers were pacifists. And a pacifist, if you've never heard of that term, is someone that won't fight or participate in military activity. The Quakers based this teaching on Jesus Christ, when he told his disciples, if you're smacked on one cheek, turn and give your enemy the other cheek, so they wouldn't fight back. The leading Quaker would be William Penn, and he would be the founder of, you guessed it, Pennsylvania. And William Penn called his colony Philadelphia, because it would be a home of brotherly love, which was the Quaker philosophy. So, what do these middle colonies have in common? Since I said we don't need to know individual colonies, what is special about this middle region? Well, the middle region had a broad range of European settlers from all over. So that meant there was great diversity that you won't see in New England or in the South. This also was a place of rich soil, so a place for good farming. Not so much cash crops that you'll see in the South, so not much tobacco or cotton, but other types of farming and agriculture. And the other big thing that's important is a tolerance of different beliefs. The Quakers themselves, a prominent religious group in the middle colonies, were very tolerant of other religious groups. Now we know the Puritans of New England are not tolerant, so that would be a good comparison between those two groups. Now the Quakers lived simple lives, but as you could see in the bottom image, were often persecuted in England for their religious beliefs. Now that we've covered the different regions, let's look at some problems that would develop in the colonies. We mentioned already the headright system. This is a system that promised free land to those who brought indentured servants to America. Many willingly came to America, especially to Virginia, as indentured servants, because they knew that after their years of service, they too could own land, start a life, start a family. If they had stayed in England, these individuals would not have this type of opportunity, no matter how hard they worked. This was their chance to own land. However, in 1676, the governor of Virginia began to establish limits on the freedoms and opportunities that once existed in the colony of Virginia. And one of those limitations included an attempt to prevent colonists from expanding, moving further west. The reason for this is that the governor worried that further westward expansion would actually result in unnecessary conflicts with the Native Americans. But for an indentured servant who came to America and gave up their time to work as a slave, this is devastating news. What would they get now out of their time and hard work? Nothing. So a leader rose up among them who encouraged dissent, and his name was Nathaniel Bacon. Bacon and a group of indentured servants decided to lead a revolt against the governor and his new rules. And this revolt included dramatic attacks against Native American villages, willingly going out and destroying villages, killing innocent Native American men, women, and children. And the rebellion ended with an attempt to punish the governor himself as the rebels burned down the capital of Virginia at Jamestown. Bacon's rebellion, as it will become known as, is considered a major turning point in colonial history. First off, because an unpopular ruler, the governor, had his power undermined by citizens. This is key because, as we'll see later in our studies, this will be a trend as Americans will lead a major rebellion later, the Revolutionary War, against their own leader, the King George III. But not only that, Bacon's rebellion is significant for another reason. It'll be a major shift away from using indentured servants, who now have proved to be very dangerous, and to using exclusively African slave labor. So Bacon's rebellion tells us why African slave labor becomes the predominant free labor source used in America. From this point on, African slave labor will grow, and it'll also become a major issue that we'll struggle with throughout American history. This illustration shows you Jamestown being set on fire during Bacon's rebellion. The new capital would have to be moved and established at Williamsburg. Now we'll look at Roman numeral 7, slavery grows. As the colonies began to grow, Britain saw them as additional sources of profit. Raw materials like cotton, lumber, were produced in the colonies and sent to England. And in England, they would be processed into manufactured goods. To increase the production of these goods required additional labor sources. What ultimately developed was known as a triangular trade route that would connect Europe, Africa, and the Americas. But what I would like to point out in this triangular trade route, the most horrific portion of this route included the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the journey that African slaves took that forcefully took them from their home and sent them to the Americas to work on plantations. Many African Americans would die on this perilous journey. And upon arrival in the Americas, the African slaves would be separated from family, forced to live and work in a culture and environment which they were unfamiliar of. However, they did not accept their condition. They knew this was unfair. Many Africans then learned means to resist the institution of slavery. Some means of resistance included sabotage, like breaking your master's tools, making it more difficult for him. They would often work slowly. Some at the time assumed that meant that Africans were lazy. But in reality, that's not true. What motivation would these Africans have to work harder or faster if they're getting no benefit in the end? The least common form of resistance were violent slave revolts. A good example of this is the Stono Rebellion, the largest violent revolt to have taken place in colonial America. Now we know the Spanish had settled in Florida, but the Spanish had tried on many occasions to instigate problems with the English to their north, and one way was by enticing their slaves to escape. Slaves were promised if they could escape into Spanish Florida, they would be granted their freedom. And so eventually, some slaves would try this. And in the Stono Rebellion, a group of 60 slaves organized an escape, and they would successfully kill 35 whites in the rebellion. However, ultimately, all the slaves in the Stono Rebellion would be caught and executed for their actions. The response to the Stono Rebellion would not be good for even future slaves in the South. The Negro Act, for instance, banned teaching slaves to read or write. Other rules included limiting slaves from being allowed to travel outside of their plantation. Not only that, but manumissions, or the idea of freeing one slave, became near impossible in the South. So the Stono Rebellion had strict consequences to slaves in the future. Again, we talked about the Middle Passage, which referred to the transatlantic sea voyage that brought slaves to the New World. Often slaves were packed together, like in this illustration of a slave ship, and many slaves would die on the voyage from Africa to the Americas. Roman numeral 8, freedom, give and take. Now, soon after the English colonies were founded, there was a great deal of political autonomy. That is because England was too preoccupied to worry about controlling the everyday lives of Americans. They were dealing with their own political struggles, including temporarily disposing of their own king. Well, what this means is that with little oversight, the colonies learned to develop great amount of freedom. However, this would change in 1660 when the monarchy in England is restored. And the king decided he wanted to rein in the colonies and all this freedom that they had become accustomed to. In an attempt to accomplish this, the Navigation Acts were passed. These acts required the American colonies to trade exclusively with England to maximize England's profits. However, being so accustomed to freedom, these acts were mostly ignored by the colonies. They continued to smuggle goods to and fro whatever country they wished. But the attempt by England to take such action was offensive to many Americans. How dare England try to strip their freedom, many thought. But from the perspective of the English government, they believed in the idea known as mercantilism, that the 13 colonies were established for the sole purpose of economic profits for England. Under mercantilism, the belief is that a country will have the greatest economic success when they sell more than they buy. These laws created a trade system where the Americas provided the raw goods, and Britain turned those raw goods into manufactured goods that they could sell to other European markets and sell them even back to the colonies. But these Navigation Acts were an attempt to severely restrict colonial trade to the benefit of England alone. These strict policies were not successful and wouldn't last for very long. In the Glorious Revolution, the King of England would be forced to sign an English Bill of Rights. And these political fights back in England ushered in an important period in the American colonies known as the period of salutary neglect. The period of salutary neglect allowed the colonies to do whatever they wanted without fear of too much interference from England. Basically, the idea is this: when the cat is away, the mice will play. And so for the American colonies, this was their opportunity to develop freedoms and do what they wished. The period of salutary neglect allowed for the growth of colonial freedom, but the desire for freedom stems from a movement known as the Enlightenment. The idea of America, in my opinion, really stems from two important movements: the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, one dealing with the mind and the other the heart. However, for centuries across the globe, no matter what country we could examine, we will see ignorant obedience to authority, whether it be to a king, a pharaoh, a dictator. The masses would blindly follow a leader simply because they are a strong man. They're the leader, therefore we should follow them. But the Enlightenment will begin to question that very mindset. The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, said that you use your mind, you use your reason to come up with better ways of doing things. One of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers is an Englishman named John Locke. Though he would never step foot in America, he could equally be considered an American founding father, because we will take many of John Locke's ideas of forming a government and make them our own. One of his most famous works is called Two Treatises of Government, where John Locke delineates the difference between divine rights and natural rights. The idea of divine rights is what most societies had always believed, that basically the king or ruler is divinely chosen by God and therefore worthy of absolute obedience. But Locke argues that what makes more sense is the idea of natural rights, that all people, no matter who you are, all people are born with natural rights, most notably the right to life, liberty, and property. Now that probably sounds familiar. You've probably heard the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's because we stole those ideas from John Locke. But another big idea we will steal from Locke is this notion of the consent of the governed, that the people should ultimately be the ones in charge, because there are more of us than there are of the ruler. A king or a ruler should never arbitrarily make decisions without the consent of the people. Now, to us living in the 21st century United States, this seems like a very familiar idea. But actually, this was profoundly unique, and many future leaders of the time, like Jefferson and Franklin, would find these words motivating. John Locke would even argue that citizens should have the right to remove an unjust leader that is denying basic natural rights. Obviously, this will be something that Americans would do when we take up arms against the English in the Revolutionary War. Now in America, the one most associated with the Enlightenment is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin believed that men and women should use their rational powers, use their mind, not just to study the laws, but also to devise means by which to better mankind. We know Benjamin Franklin himself was a famous scientist, but he also believed in other means of human improvement. He produced an annual book known as Poor Richard's Almanac, which was beloved by Americans all over the colonies. In this almanac, Benjamin Franklin provided words of wisdom on a variety of topics, including things like the weather, personal relationships, farming, and tips for living. Pretty much everything. The Enlightenment produced in the American colonies an affinity toward freedom that they took very seriously. And we could see a good example of this if we examine a famous case known as the Zinger trial. In this, a New York newspaper allowed for the printing of editorials criticizing the royal governor. And an attempt by the government was made to shut down this paper because of printing these criticisms. But in the end, it was the newspaper that won, and also the idea of freedom of the press. So I like to talk about the Zinger trial because it is important for this idea of freedom of speech and freedom of the press that will later be developed when we create the United States. But for many Enlightenment thinkers, sometimes there was this struggle between the Enlightenment and religion itself. For some, like Benjamin Franklin, the answer to this was deism. Deism is a belief that God is simply a clockmaker, and he sets the clock of the world to begin, but then leaves the world to its own devices. Therefore, it's our job as humans to fix the world's problems, not God's. So you could probably see how this could easily fit into an Enlightenment mindset. But the Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals, also had a significant impact on what will become America. Like I mentioned, I like to think of the Enlightenment as an influence on the mind and the Great Awakening as an influence on the heart. About 100 years after the settlement of a religious colony in Massachusetts, we're going to see a decline in an emphasis on religion and more of a focus on reason and the Enlightenment. And this would result in reduced church attendance overall. So the Great Awakening is going to be an attempt to bring back the fervor of faith into the colonies. Rather than Puritan stoicism, the Great Awakening will emphasize emotionalism in the revival meetings. The most notable preacher of the Great Awakening is a man named Jonathan Edwards. His famous sermon would be heard in all the colonies, and it is known as Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which encouraged people to turn back to the faith that started some of these original colonies, or, if they did not, they could face an eternity in hell, which was a motivating factor for many. These religious revivals would spread across the 13 colonies and impact the hearts and minds of many Americans, including some of our founding fathers. However, what is unique for our study of American history is the way the Great Awakening changed people's perceptions of ingrained authority. For centuries, it was thought that the church and its leaders should not be questioned. But during the Great Awakening, we see the birth of new religious denominations and people choosing the type of church that fits their needs the best. So in this way, I like to think of it as being democratic. People choose the leader that they like and attend that church. But what this also means is that Americans are willing to defy leaders and traditions. And if they're willing to do that, what else might they be willing to do? So from the Great Awakening, we see that maybe Americans would be willing to defy other traditions of leadership, like the king and authority of England itself. Now in class, we did some stimulus-based multiple choice practice. Remember, the strategy that I taught you is, does the queen steal apples? Directions, title, questions, stimulus, answer. So I would encourage you, even at home, to do some of these practice stimulus-based multiple choice so that you are ready for the test. Now, the last thing I would like to hit on is a topic we haven't discussed much yet in Period 2, and that is Native Americans. Now, as the colonies began to grow, so will the environmental damage that it will bring. The fur trade, for example, would have devastating effects on lake and wetland environments, and the overhunting of the buffalo will kill that animal near extinction. Obviously, that's going to have huge impacts on the environment and Native Americans that depended upon the buffalo for survival. But death and disease would also continue to plague Native American populations. Disease often forced tribes to change. Individuals were often left alone when their entire tribe might die out. So to cope, individuals would often have to join together with other Native American groups, sometimes groups that have a different language and different culture, but they join together for the purposes of survival. This is known as tribalization. However, for some Native Americans, to them survival meant adapting and changing, and even adopting European culture. These Native Americans could be called praying Indians because of their conversion to Christianity. Sometimes, though, like we've discussed before, Native Americans would attack. They would turn to violence. King Philip's War is the largest Indian attack in colonial America. This war consisted of a 3-year battle between the New England settlers and that of the Native Americans. The destruction included attacks on more than half of New England towns, so many people would be affected by King Philip's War. In the end, like so many Native American wars, this would prove to be unsuccessful for the natives. Once defeated, the natives were forced to give up more and more of their ancestral lands to the European settlers. So, we've come to the end of another period. Period 2 is done and over. I hope you found this video very helpful. Please remember to leave me a comment below and subscribe for more videos. See you again next time for Period 3.